Okay, good afternoon, everyone. I'd like to welcome you to our afternoon panel, the first of two this afternoon, on global implications. And before I get into the biographies of the speakers that we have here today, just a quick reminder of what the schedule is going to be like this afternoon. This panel will run until about 2:30 or 2:40. We're then going to have a 30-minute break with tea and coffee, followed by our last panel on the question of reform, which will actually run from 3 to 4:30. There's just a little typo on your schedule, so you just may want to note that. So we have three distinguished panelists here with us this afternoon on our global implications panel. And I'll just read you a brief description of what we plan on discussing in this panel. The panel will examine the global implications of electronic surveillance by governments, the role of electronic surveillance in relation to individual privacy, national security, diplomacy, journalism, and civil society will be critically discussed. And as you can imagine, our speakers have their own experiences with this issue, and we'll also be talking about that from their own perspectives. So our first panelist today is going to be Rafal Rohozinski. And Rafal Rohozinski is the CEO of SecDev Group, a leader in advanced analytics operating at the intersection of cyberspace, political change, conflict, and armed violence. He spent 17 years working in an operational capacity in 37 countries, including conflict zones in the CIC, the Middle East, and Africa, and previously directed the Advanced Network Research Group at the University of Cambridge. Rafal is the author of numerous guidelines, strategy papers, and evaluations in the ICT, public administration, and governance and poverty reduction fields for the UN, EU, US Department of Defense, and national governments. His research focuses on the nexus between globalization and information technologies and the changing dynamics of conflict and security. Following Rafal, we have someone who we've already heard referenced several times throughout this conference, Bill Binney. Between 2001 and mid-2007, Mr. Binney was a consultant on analysis and analytic techniques to various agencies of the US government intelligence community, NSA, CIA, NRO, and Customs and Border Protection in the Department of Homeland Security. From 1970 to 2001, Mr. Binney was a civilian employee of the NSA. At NSA, Mr. Binney held numerous positions: Technical Director of the World Geopolitical and Military Analysis, Operations Directorate Analysis Skill Field Leader, member of the NSA Senior Technical Review Panel, Chair of the Technical Advisory Panel to the Foreign Relations Council, co-founder of the SIGINT Automation Research Center, an agency representative to the National Technology Alliance Executive Board, and technical director of the office, as well as a leading analyst for Warning for over 20 years. And lastly, we have Thomas Drake. Thomas Drake is a former senior executive with the National Security Agency, a United States Air Force and Navy veteran, computer software expert, and whistleblower. While at the NSA, he blew the whistle on what he contended was fraud, loss of intelligence, wrongdoing, and a dragnet electronic surveillance and data mining program conducted on a vast scale by the NSA after 9/11. Mr. Drake argued that this program violated and subverted the Constitution, as well as individual sovereignty and privacy, while weakening national security and fundamentally eroding civil liberties. In April 2010, he was charged by the US Department of Justice with a 10 felony count Espionage Act indictment, facing 35 years in prison. All 10 original charges were eventually dropped, and he eventually pled to one misdemeanor count for exceeding authorized use of a computer. Jesslyn Radek of the Government Accountability Project, who helped represent him, called it an act of civil disobedience. He is the 2011 recipient of the Ridenhour Prize for Truth-Telling and co-recipient of the Sam Adams Associates for Integrity in Intelligence Award. And I will be moderating the panel this afternoon. So, is this on? Yes, great. So I'd like to begin by inviting Rafal to deliver our initial comments, and then we'll hear from Bill and Tom respectively. Rafal.
Great, thank you. And initial comments, maybe a too august word to what I have to say. One of the things when we have to look at the global implications of the emergence of a global surveillance state or electronic surveillance state is to actually ask ourselves the question, is that in effect what we see emerging? Is this a manifestation of something which is unique to our age, unique to a set of circumstances that are brought into being, or is this an extension of this tension between the social contract defined between citizens and states that has predated cyberspace and been going on for quite a long time? And for that, I think we need to kind of consider what is it that has brought about this particular debate, and that is clearly being the emergence of cyberspace as a domain, a principal domain for human activity. If we look back just 15, 20 years ago, 40,000 people were connected to the internet, largely physicists, people working at universities, who were communicating because of the fact that they wanted to share computer resources. Over the past 20 years, over 2.5 billion humans have attached themselves to this global network. The center, the heart of commerce, the center of heart of our social and economic and political beings has moved into this domain. What is not caught up, what is not necessarily being fixed, is the institutional rules, the institutional framework that allows us to be able to moderate and create rule sets in that cyberspace equivalent to that which we've had in the physical space. And that's an institutional and historical problem that I think is quite important to bear in mind. It's important to bear in mind because we are living in what we might call an era of open empowerment. And that is the scale-free empowerment of individuals that is running faster than what institutions can adapt to. And we can look at it on one hand in terms of what we may think are, or we can portray as being negative manifestations of that, surveillance. But I think it's also important to look at it from its positive side. More individuals have been empowered to take control of their lives through access to communication and knowledge than at any other stage in humanity. We've had a mass empowerment, a mass leap forward in terms of the potential for humans, for individuals, to make changes into their societies that we haven't seen any time before. And that, I think, in some respects, has to be seen as the other side of what we would be discussing today in terms of global implications. In terms of looking at this from a historical frame, I think we also need to ask ourselves, is what we are seeing something new or simply a different manifestation of something that we have seen before? Historically, states have always sought to limit communications. If we think back to 2-3 centuries ago with the emergence of the postal system, black chambers essentially were the norm. Communications were meant to be private, they're meant to be interpreted. Similarly, with the early emergence of telegraphs and telephones, effectively these grew up at the same time as the emergence of surveillance systems and surveillance monitoring that emerged them. So the question is, if there's something new. Are we outraged because this truly represents some new form of surveillance that we're seeing right now? Are we outraged because we think that the last 20 years of the internet coming into being, cyberspace and being, represented a break with the past, an opportunity for not to live under surveillance, and now that's coming under threat? Or are we outraged just because we're outraged, because we can't really differentiate between the new and what's new to us? And I think these are important questions to answer to consider because the answers to them are quite complex. One, it's very clear that the citizen-state relationship is being redefined by the information era. And that's being done globally, not just here, and it was done before Snowden, and it was done before the NSA. Fundamental rights and freedoms are being redefined at the individual level and at the state level. 9/11, I would argue, for us, meaning societies in North America, really introduced a significant deviation to a process of developing rules that would ultimately reset that bubble between state and individuals and their legitimate role of state institutions within that. It shifted us to a much more security focus just at the time as cyberspace was becoming far more important to all aspects of life, and invested certain institutions with a means to be able to act on our behalf in that domain without the kind of public accountability that would have existed perhaps had 9/11 not happened. So I think in that respect, it's important to look at the sort of watershed event, if you like, of both 9/11 and the Snowden revelations in terms of three things. One, what have they fundamentally changed? And here I'm thinking of the Snowden revelations. What processes have they simply accelerated that were happening anyways? And thirdly, what has largely stayed the same? In other words, what we largely need to look at is being simply a continuation of what we had in the past. So probably in terms of what has fundamentally changed, there are two things that are really important. One, in the proximate future, the US has really lost the high ground in terms of its mastery, or uncontested mastery of cyberspace. And that means both the trust aspects of American industry leading the innovation of what cyberspace was becoming, the norms under which it was expanding, i.e. its governance mechanisms, and importantly, an aspect of simply intelligence dominance. In other words, the ability to be able to collect against cyberspace in a way that nobody else ever had. I'd argue that that third part, the actual mastery of cyberspace from an intelligence dimension, is probably the least important. Although Snowden's 99-cent thumb drive may have nullified trillions of dollars worth of research, we also have to bear in mind that a lot of what has actually been revealed, especially vis-a-vis the UK, not so much the US because I know less about it, are all programs that have only been in existence for the last 5 years. In other words, this is not a huge multi-year investment. And certainly there's a lot more scope to be able to recapture an intelligence dominance on the technology side than anything else. The trust, however, in industry, the trust in terms of global norm setting, that's something which is gone and which is unlikely to come back at any time in the future. What processes have become accelerated? Well, first and foremost, I think there's been the Snowden revelations have really accelerated the militarization of cyberspace. Countries now have a playbook by which they can develop capabilities which they knew they theoretically could, but weren't quite sure how they would want to apply in a practical context. I think that's a fairly dangerous thing, but on the other hand, I'd say that that's not something that they weren't doing anyway. This simply means that we're going to see the process moving forward in a much faster way. Similarly is the balkanization of cyberspace. Already over the last 5 years, it's been clear that the old governance mechanism of cyberspace, which is being based upon a multi-stakeholder approach, was dying, and that states that had a vested interest in creating digital borders, i.e. imposing national sovereignty over information resources, were going to do so. However, with the Snowden revelations and the clarity with which the global normative environment really advantaged the United States in terms of its position, I think has accelerated greatly and brought on board a lot of other countries who now see the national territorialization of cyberspace being very important. It's no longer the Chinas and the Irans that are saying we need national digital borders. It's now Europe saying that we need national digital borders for different reasons. And that's going to change the whole governance. What's going to remain the same? What's going to remain the same is going to be this redefinition of the state-citizenship relationship and the challenge that it forms to nation states. Internally, although we talk a lot about privacy, we fail to recognize that there's other areas in which law has not caught up with the way that we need to understand cyberspace as being now a center of gravity for human activity. Let me give you one example. Back in the 1920s, if I was to stand outside my place of work, creating a picket line, essentially saying that I want to deny my employer my services and his ability to do commerce, that was considered to be an illegal act. Okay? Strikes and labor action are now considered to be part of the indelible rights of laborers in their protestation with management. Flash forward to 2014. Let's say I was an employee of Amazon.ca, and I had a displeasure with my management, a management-employee dispute. And I decided, since Amazon is not a bricks-and-mortar business, to deny service to Amazon.ca's ability to do commerce, a denial of service attack. That would be called a criminal act. Now, I'm not advocating here that DDoS attacks should be seen as an indelible right in terms of management disputes, but what I am trying to point out is the fact that we really haven't caught up in terms of being able to define what rights need to translate into cyberspace in the way that they currently exist in physical space. And there are other examples. For example, newspapers have the right to harbor whistleblowers. If I'm an individual blogger and do that, I subject myself to the full prosecution of the law. So there's lots of numerous gaps here besides privacy that I think have been raised as a result of that, which really have continued, maybe being accelerated, maybe being cast in a different way by the Snowden revelations, but actually go beyond the old, beyond just the issues that have been raised by Snowden. I think there's also a danger in the Snowden revelations in the way that they've created a bit of an ideological balkanization purely on the terms or loaded terms such as surveillance and privacy. We have to recognize that surveillance per se is not just a negative concept of the state looking at the individual. Look at public health. Public health is largely being transformed by the fact that we use metadata that is drawn from your hospital records, from your doctor's offices, to understand the vectors of disease, how they spread, etc. Part of the transaction of modern society is that we surrender information about ourselves as individuals to be able to contribute to community safety and security. Back in the last decade, WHO, for example, recognized that it's not just diseases that have a social pathology, but violence does as well. Meaning looking at the precursors of violence in society, the conditions that lead to it, allow you to do early intervention. Police forces now use surveillance of social services data as a way of being able to identify where they can intervene with individuals and communities before they hit the criminal justice system. That form of surveillance has had tremendous positive effects, and it's important to recognize that it is a part of modern society that actually needs to be looked at and understood as a balance, and not just simply reifying it into state society, surveillance of society by the state. Similarly, intelligence in of itself is a concept that has to be well considered. Intelligence at its root is really the discipline of taking in information, subjecting it to a rigorous process of analysis, testing it in order to determine risks and probabilities. Intelligence is necessary in the information age because that's how you make sense of data and are able to take calculated decisions. We are going to see more use of intelligence by government departments as well as corporations as well as individuals, because that has become the norm in terms of what gives advantage and allows us to make calculated decisions in it. States will need to act in cyberspace. They will need mechanisms to be able to deal with open empowerment, recognizing that the threat is not just terrorism in the way that we've reified it, but that the negative manifestations of open empowerment have wide-ranging repercussions. For example, Syrian government used to be seen as the principal vector of threat to those seeking now for political change. In reality, it's now ISIS, essentially a group that is non-state that has greater capabilities. In Mexico, the narcotraficantes actually have more signals intelligence and intelligence capabilities than the Mexico state, and an ability to act in a negative fashion in our societies that far dwarf the potential for a few radicalized Islamic actors themselves. In other words, the threat actors have morphed, the timescales of reacting against them have shortened, the ability to, or the capabilities and the necessity for states to have an ability to be able to police cyberspace and act proactively is actually quite good. But at the same time, I think we do need institutional reform. And here I think this is where the greatest benefit has come out of the Snowden revelations, is that it's given us a milestone for institutional reform that previously simply didn't exist. This kind of conversation, this kind of panel, and many others that have happened elsewhere simply would not be happening in the absence of at least this kind of unbottling of issues which since 9/11 have really been bottled up in the security bubble itself. And I think that's normal, and I think that that's regular. Let's take a look at how institutions have changed even in our lifetime or lifetime of our grandparents in ways that we haven't really expected. For those of you who remember, and none of you here would, so I'll tell you a historical fact, but when automobiles were first introduced into the roadways of the United Kingdom in the early part of the last century, who was responsible for setting the road signs? The Automobile Association, because it was felt that only drivers were knowledgeable enough to be able to set the rules that made sense. Now, who would put the Automobile Association in charge of setting road signs in Canada or the United States now? We won't. Why? Because we've recognized that there needs to be a public accountability function over these activities that previously didn't exist. Similarly, air traffic control. Air traffic control was developed and initially came out of the military. However, with the growth of volume and importance of air traffic in our societies, it's become a civilianized function. So too, will the functions of the NSA, CIC, and others have to be civilianized and normalized. There's no argument, I think, even on this panel, of the important role of intelligence agencies will continue to play in terms of ensuring community and national security for all of our countries. But there are aspects of their activities that frankly could be better carried out by civilian agencies that are subject to normal oversight and not even special oversight. That's something that should happen. That's something which I hope will happen. Thank you.
Thank you, Rafal, for your insightful remarks. Bill, would you like to go ahead?
Sure. First of all, I agree with most of what you said. My real concern over the years has been primarily with governments and what governments do. I mean, after all, if companies are going to look at data about individuals, they can't really do too much against you. But governments can send police forces and things like that and really interrupt your life, put you in jail and things like that. They have the power to do that. Companies don't necessarily have that. They can probably cause you some difficulty, but nothing like a government. And so since I had a hand in designing some of the programs that are currently being used, it's really something that I can see exactly where they're headed and what they're doing. And when they first started this back in 2001, I objected immediately because I'd been working the Soviet Union, looking at a totalitarian state for like 30-some years, okay? So it was very clear to me that this was a totalitarian process. You don't assemble knowledge about every citizen in your country unless you want to control them, and that's exactly what the KGB and the MVD did, also the Stasi in East Germany, and all the way back to Augustus. Totalitarian states wanted to know about their populations so they could control it, and that's what this information gathering on individuals is all about. Up to that point, up until 2001, the NSA, the government that I was working for, was focusing on people who were doing international crime, or governments or other potential adversaries, or people who had not necessarily positive perspectives on the West, people advocating jihad or violence, things like that. Those were the kinds of things they were focusing on. So it was like a focused attack on problems that were primarily international crime or military threats. But after 9/11, the entire perspective on how they had addressed data in use in every form of communication, primarily the public switch telephone network or the internet, those were the two main ones they focused on because that's where most everybody communicates. But they also looked at banking and travel and all kinds of things like that. So everything that involved movement of people, tracking people in every environment, were candidates for collecting information so that you could reassemble it into what we'd call graphs, relationships graphs. This was all done by metadata. That was how you can pull together the relationships that everybody has with everybody else in the world. That's all done by metadata. For us in the United States, that's a violation of our First Amendment rights, which is we have the right under the First Amendment to free association. It doesn't say we have the right to free association as long as NSA knows about it, right? It doesn't say that. But that's what that means, and also the fact that they're pulling this metadata together. The metadata, if you go on the web, you can do a reverse lookup on the phone numbers, or if you have the block allocations out of the IANA, you can have IPs or use MAC numbers or other kinds of indicators across the internet to figure out where people are in the world. Or if you're mobile, for example, your mobile phones are numbered uniquely, and anywhere except in Zone 1 in the world, they're numbered in unique blocks. In Zone 1, you have a mixed allocation. Zone 1 is the United States, Canada, and some of the islands. So, but the idea there is all of these systems are so organized that you can basically tell where everybody is. And for example, Dianne Feinstein said, well, it's just a phone number to and from, date, time, and duration, and location. Now, the location included 5 billion GPS locations for all the mobile phones every day, as well as just the knowledge of the public switch telephone network, so you know exactly where the landlines go. And it's a reverse lookup of the phone book of the entire world. And they compromised that they had that on the 60 Minutes show on the 15th of December of last year. They actually put a half-hour segment out on 60 Minutes trying to do a powder puff building up NSA's reputation. That's what they're trying to do. But in there, they showed a list of phone numbers inside the United States, and in there it listed the number calling, the number called, date, time, and duration, and then it listed the state. Then the most important column that they should have suppressed but didn't was the city. Now, you can't get the city unless you reverse look up every number in the book, because the local codes include multiple cities, okay? So that they compromise that. So they, so they have a reverse index look of every phone number in the United States, but they probably also do the rest of the world. So that's the kind of information they would buy from other companies around the world. All the telecoms would be participating in this. They would pay for it. So it's extra money to the bottom lines of those telecoms. So internationally, this is now getting to be an international issue. So an NSA started out by looking at US citizens, not foreigners. So now they're looking at foreigners as well, and have been for 10 years. So you're all being treated like US citizens. We're all the same, okay? All the data that we have is being collected. And by the way, this is all done by software. These relationships are all automatically built. It's all done by software. It's not humans, it's just software. And in the meantime, it also indexes all the content to that relationships in those metadata graphs. So that now you have not just the metadata showing the relationship, but you have all of the information that was used to build those relationships in terms of emails, file transfers, phone call recordings. If they are targeting you, they will record you. So all of that information is then indexed and can be timelined, so you can show your entire electronic life. Now, they say they're only looking at 5 years. I doubt that they've destroyed anything. It's not in their nature to destroy any bit of information they collect. So from 2001 up, I bet that's why they're building Bluffdale. They just opened another facility they started building on Fort Meade, and last summer they broke ground for a 600,000 square foot facility to store information. They alleged it was for cybersecurity. But the information you need to do cybersecurity is exactly the same information you need to build information about individuals or relationships between individuals or groups. It's all the same data. So it's just more storage, that's all that means. So that's just more information that they're collecting, and they need to build more capacity to store it, because these algorithms they're running are trying to get, and this was part of the big data initiative that the White House released about 1.5 years ago, that was asking for or soliciting private companies to come across or build algorithms that would automatically go through large sets of information or big data and find out or figure out what in that data what's important for people to look at. So that is where they're headed, because they've accumulated all this data. The people can't handle it. So they made themselves dysfunctional because of the way they're set up, okay? Humans have to interact with the data. Software only takes them so far, and they don't have the automated algorithms that do analysis automation. That's their problem. So those are the kinds of things that are being set up, and were set up since the 11 September of 2001, and now it's being, and over that period of time, since then, it's being spread around the world to all kinds of relationships. From the last papers that I've seen published from the Snowden material, there are 30 other countries participating in this program. And of those, they're all using the X key score, which I refer to as the Google for bulk data collection. That is, if you use X key score, you can put in your selection parameters, and it goes into these databases and pulls out the related data, just like Google does with their storage in 8 different banks, okay? It's the same principle, except one's in Bluffdale, one's in Fort Meade, one's in Fort Gordon. You know, they're spread around. But the idea is X key score is that Google kind of query to get that information back. But still, it doesn't it doesn't automatically analyze what that information implies. And that's really what the big data initiative is all about, and that's what that's trying to do. But what we're saying is it's spreading this concept of surveillance around the world to at least 30 countries. This is totalitarianism. If you buy into this, this is what you're buying into. That principle is a totalitarian principle. It's not compatible with democracy. If you want a democracy, you can't tolerate this. So, but the other part of it is, once power like this knowledge is assembled by a government, it's a human frailty. You can't give them power without them using it sometime or other. Sooner or later, they're going to decide to use it. Well, I was aware of the FBI using this information from September of 2001 on. They were included in this. Director Mueller said that in his interview with Bart Gellman in Time magazine in March of 2011. So I was aware that they were using it, but I didn't know what the rules were or how they actually did it. And then an article came out in Reuters, I believe it was, in August of 2013, this last year, where they talked about this information in NSA collection of everybody's data. It was being analyzed by a drug enforcement agency and a specific subset of that called the Special Operations Division. That division was responsible to look into the NSA collected data and find out what would be important information for law enforcement anywhere in the world, and use that to pass it around for local and state police to arrest people. And in the process, there were guidelines on how they could handle this information. That is, you could alert the police to go to a certain place and wait for a truck to drive in. They go arrest the person, bring the drug dogs in, find the dope, and then take it to court. But in the meantime, you could not reference in affidavits to the court, in any testimony to the judge in the court, or the prosecuting and defending attorneys. You couldn't talk to any of them and say that this was from NSA data, because it's not admissible in a court of law in the United States, because it wasn't acquired with a warrant. Okay, so that's not admissible. So if they went in with that, it would be thrown out immediately, all right? So now they have to do what they call a parallel construction. That is, given that they know where the data that implicates the person in the crime is, then they should do normal policing procedure and go ask for, issue warrants for soliciting this information, either from the local telephone companies or the service providers for email or whatever, assemble the data, and then use that data in the courts to prosecute the person. This is basically what I refer to as a planned programmed perjury policy run by the Department of Justice of the United States. But it's not just us now. We're not just corrupting our judicial process. Because at the bottom of the one slide that had the governance of how you handle this information, it says you don't pass this data either to foreign counterparts. Now that's getting back into all the rest of the police forces around the world. So now we're spreading this. This is how power is used. Eventually this is what happens. This is the frailty of humanity. Humanity does this. And so now they're now spreading this around the world through all the police agencies and corrupting the judicial processes around the world. So we're not just defeating our processes, but our supposedly democratic processes. This is why I've been calling what we have over our way is now a police state. It's not quite a totalitarian police state, but all the necessary requirements to make it that are in place. So now we just take that, what I call the turning of the key, to make it the totalitarian, and now a totalitarian police state. This is what the global implications are. This is a threat not just to our democracy, but to democracy everywhere in the world, and also totalitarian states too. They would love this. Like, for example, Wolfgang Schmidt, who was a lieutenant colonel in the East German Stasi, stated in, I think it was August of last year, he said, when he was commenting about NSA spying on the U.S. citizens, he said, "For us, this would have been a dream come true." Well, I mean, and getting back to it, this is data that's really being collected on everybody and shared in a common data set and a common graph, and that's going around the world, not just the Five Eyes, right? That's not just, it's not limited there, because X-keyscore takes it into so many more countries. But my concern is that we are really being threatened in terms of the way of our entire governments operate. It's being rotted in secret. All of this was done by a secret court, in secret, with secret interpretations of laws and secret interpretations of constitutional, what is constitutional and what isn't. And those kinds of things you don't make decisions about in secret in a democracy. I mean, that's simply not, you don't make a secret decision on what is constitutional or not in secret. I'm sorry. That doesn't cut it in a democracy. Well, that's what our government's been doing. That's what they've been doing. And they've been doing with the not just the metadata, but the content. And they're not just doing it for our government, they're doing it for a whole lot of governments. And it's not just metadata. You have to think about that. It's not just metadata. Although metadata is bad enough, If you think about metadata, that connects your entire network, who you're associated with all around the world. It graphs everybody's relationship. So that tells you the scope of your interactions with everyone else in the world. That's with no content at all. Okay? And then when you map the content to it, and then do a graph on a timeline, all this is done by code, by the way. It's not done by people. All that's sitting in the databases. All they have to do is call it up. Now, whether or not NSA analysts are looking at it or not, it's not really that relevant. What police forces are doing is much more relevant when it comes to looking at individuals, because that's where you're destroying your freedoms. So this is my biggest concern globally. It's not just the United States, it's everybody in the world. We all need to be concerned about this.
Thank you, Bill.
Thank you.
Tom?
Yeah, it's quite sobering to be here in Canada. Fortunately, I wasn't stopped at the border like it was the last time I was here. I just want to say that I grew up in Vermont, little state south of the border, and it was considered the first republic. There was significant concern during the debate. Vermont was a republic for 14 years as to whether or not Vermont would join Canada or join the new United States of America, and they chose the United States. But I feel very close to Canada, having traveled here extensively in the past, met many Canadians who would come down to Vermont. I used to live in upstate New York, in the counties that bordered Canada. And I got to learn, while growing up in Vermont, what democracy was all about. And it was exemplified by the Vermont town meeting, in which everybody had the chance to say their piece, whether you disagreed or agreed with them or not. And I've just mentioned that because it was really, for me, as a young adult, it really, as I look back, particularly with the ordeals that I've been through over the past number of years, and sitting here in front of you as a free human being, which I can't begin to describe to you what freedom means, the global implications of a surveillance state are vast. A surveillance state regime, let's be absolutely honest, is a clear and compelling danger to all forms of democracy and to humanity at large. Because if you want perfect security, the zero-sum game that somehow we have to know it all, we have to know everything, the motto, by the way, of the Stasi in the East German fascist surveillance state, literally to know everything, you have to erode all liberties and rights and freedoms. This is a false dichotomy, and yet what we are faced with, the global implications of what we are faced with, are truly troubling. This is unprecedented in world history. The United States did not originate the surveillance state, but it's certainly taken the surveillance state and put it on steroids. Electronic networks have become the surveillance platforms of choice. NSA truly does have a hoarding complex. And it's being conducted and collected on an enormous scale, and it's not just for intelligence purposes. We're talking industrial espionage. We're talking about financial espionage. These are some of the elephants in the surveillance room. And these extraordinary instruments of power, particularly when combined with certain large corporations that have vast amounts of information about us, they're not going to give up this power willingly or lightly. And of course, so much of this is being done without our consent. I don't remember checking a box as a citizen of the United States saying, oh yes, the government has a right to know everything there is about me. It truly is an anathema form of government. But please, and I'm going to counter some of the earlier conversations, don't look to the United States as a beacon of hope. Don't assume that if you set up a parliamentary oversight committee that that's the answer. The oversight in the United States is a joke. They've been co-opted for decades, truth be told. It arose, interestingly enough, out of vast violations, even at the time, making this era look like, this era makes that era look like pikers by comparison, because of severe abuses of instruments of national power by the executive branch in particular. Just look up Minaret and Shamrock and Chaos and COINTELPRO. You'll see how far the United States, or NSA collecting essentially every telex from right after World War II up until the mid-70s, going in and out of the US. I'm going to agree right now with John Adams from the earlier panel. We're data rich, but intelligence stupid. You see, if anybody's been following the news, guess what? Guess where US intel failed once again? The Ukrainian crisis. Actually said that Russia would not invade. Oh, invade. I guess they were invited. Force protection, now inside Ukrainian borders. Look, Putin's in the catbird seat, okay? And who's going to stop him? This is the classic catch-22. I have the power, who's going to stop me? There's a whole lot of history there. It's far more complex than what mainstream media is telling you. But once again, the United States intelligence apparatus went on the record. Here's the other big surveillance elephant in the room, and it has major global implications because it directly threatens our ability to use all of the extraordinary instruments, the financial instruments, electronic instruments, all the networks in terms of our everyday life, the very things we depend on in society. And that's the corporate side of this. I made brief reference to it. When you combine the most significant IT, telcos, internet service provider companies with government, they are perversely incentivized to promote an indefinite and amorphous set of existential threats to persist the national security state. And you have to remember, and I'll make direct reference to a speech I gave a couple of years ago at the Web 2.0 Summit. And I made people in the room extraordinarily uncomfortable. I said, not only are you deriving a profit from subscribers who willingly consent and check the box for terms and conditions, some of you in this room are actually selling that same data or providing access to that same data for a profit back to the government in secret without your customer consent. And so Lord Acton was right. Power does tend, didn't say it actually does, but tends to corrupt. Absolute power corrupts absolutely. Imagine having this extraordinarily secret power. And Bill's right. The weaknesses in the human condition are such, and history is not kind here. It's going to be used for other purposes. That same Stasi officer was interviewed said it's naive to believe that collecting this kind of information will not be used for other purposes besides the purpose for which it was stated. And there's another myth I want to just pop right now, that somehow if you come up with the right law, that's going to work. If the US history here, particularly post 9/11, is any guide at all, using legislation, using executive orders, and other unitary theories of the commander-in-chief powers under Article 2 of the Constitution to control democracy. I'm going to emphasize it, to control democracy. Look, NSA itself was created in the deepest of secrecy. It was not created by Congress. It was literally a stroke of a pen by Truman. It's a military organization. Combine that with the commander-in-chief powers, although the last time Congress actually declared war was World War II, you have a really dangerous precedent because you're militarizing the domestic space. You're militarizing all of this information because the tendency is there's something, we have a threat, means we have to own the very instruments that the threat lives or exists on, or that we allege live and exist on. Look, this is particularly personal for me. You heard the introduction. When you're faced with a distinct prospect of looking at 35 years in prison, let's just say things get really focused in terms of what matters in life. In fact, during one point in their investigation, they actually threatened me with spending the rest of my life in prison if I did not cooperate with the government investigation. Just think about the implications for a moment. All I did was take an oath to a constitution, to support and defend that constitution, an idea and how to govern ourselves. And by by holding up the mirror to power that had violated not only the Constitution, but was engaging in vast electronic surveillance, multi-billion-dollar fraud, waste, and abuse, that act of civil disobedience was criminalized. And they came after me with everything they had. First whistleblower actually indicted since Daniel Ellsberg. And so this other meme of metadata, I'm going to pop that bubble as well. Yeah, metadata is the roadmap to human behavior. So if I'm the government in secret, being able to persistently analyze and retroactively analyze all that data, what am I going to know about you? I'm going to give you a little hint into the subsequent panel, the following panel to this. I'm going to run a little exercise in terms of why reform is so crucial. I'm going to make it as personal as possible for you, just a taste of why reform is absolutely essential at this time. It's now. It's not a question of when. So we face vast implications in terms of the surveillance state. And what's happening is that our sovereignty, and I'm sure we're going to be discussing this in terms of the implications, our sovereignty as people is under direct assault. I'm going to emphasize our sovereignty as people due to mass surveillance and unaccountable government largely operating in secret. The government has no right to know that I have nothing to hide. And I have the inalienable right to hide my privacy against unreasonable searches and seizures. But I've heard this meme that if you have nothing to hide, you have nothing to worry about, or you have nothing to fear. Do you know where that quote came from? And it just chills me, given when I was a German-Russian linguist listening in on the communications of East Germany and knowing what the dark side history of Germany itself was during the period before World War II and World War II. You know where that quote came from? Joseph Goebbels. You got to wake up, folks. There's massive info ops and propaganda going on here because the very statement that you have nothing to hide, that's privacide. The assumption is that there is nothing that you own. Nothing. Just think about it. That means no matter what your rights are, citizens become subjects to and subjects of the state. I stand before you as a free man. And I'll just end with this because I don't want to get to the Q&A and the half hour here ahead of us. The government spent many years coming after me. And it's still extraordinarily emotional for me to say the following, that when the government is coming after you with all the instruments they have at their disposal, including lying, misrepresenting, doctoring, framing, making up evidence just to an attempt to eventually convict you. When they're doing everything they can to take away the very freedoms and liberties and rights that I took an oath 4 times in my government career to defend. What does that say? They're extraordinarily precious rights. They are inalienable rights. They're sovereign rights that are given to us as human beings. No government, no power, whether in open or in secret, can take those away. And so ultimately, the implications here come back to us as people, and what are we going to do about it? Because the technology, I will say, is actually getting cheaper. Cheaper by the dozen. And it's inversely proportional, because now the capacity exists, as Bill has very eloquently stated here and in other fora, to essentially store everything there is to store electronically at very low cost. The government is incentivized to actually store it. And let's be clear here, before the Q&A, this metadata myth that it's only metadata. Metadata is the index to content. You cannot have metadata without content being generated. The very act of content being created and generated and shared and sent and coursing through the networks creates the metadata. It's one click away. And the thing that the US government is desperate to protect is the fact that they're actually ongoingly conducting vast collections of content as we speak. Automated.
All right, so we'll proceed to a brief discussion, and then we'll have our public Q&A for the audience. Tom, Bill, one thing you touched on in your discussion extensively was your feeling that the National Security Agency, what it is and the reach it has, is in some ways unprecedented. And the desire for information is significant. One of the defenses that we've heard from individuals like James Clapper and others involved in the US intelligence community is the idea that this is an activity, the degree of surveillance that the NSA is engaged in, that every country is involved in. This is another form of national security and defense protection that all countries partake in. And also this continual emphasis of the notion of information being gathered for, quote, foreign intelligence purpose. Could the panel as a whole speak to this idea? Do you feel that we have that the NSA is an exceptional case? Or do you feel this idea of global surveillance and the increase in surveillance is something that we're seeing across governments around the world?
Well, yeah, I think I'll take that one. I think NSA, by its nature, having so much in the way of resources, is doing the job a larger job, and probably better job than virtually anybody else in the world. But everybody in the world wants to do this. Okay, this is nothing new. They all want to gain intelligence about other countries. Every country looks at other countries and say, I want to know what they're thinking. That's really intelligence. That's really what they're after. And everybody tries to do it. It's just that they only have so much in the way of resources to make that happen. NSA has a lot more. So it makes them possible to do a lot more. That's all.
I think I'd add to that something, and this has to really do with the way that NSA has changed over the last 20 years as a result of the emergence of cyberspace. I mean, when you would have started with the NSA, you were principally involved in signals intelligence, right? It was capturing communications pairs by being able to directly attack communication systems, meaning either intercepting transmissions in flight or owning devices. I think what's happened in the last 20 years is as cyberspace has replaced the communications medium, and as the United States as the locus where cyberspace emerged from as a result of its engineering lead, its industrial lead, the fact that companies that built the internet were global, effectively the two things became indelible. No other signals intelligence agency had the same capabilities because no other country effectively owned cyberspace in the way that the US did. Now, where I think I would slightly differ with the position that you were taking, and which I think is important to I think also recognize is the NSA does not collect against me as an individual directly. It does so with the complicity of industry. Currently, it's not independent systems that do that. It's being able to harvest against telecommunications companies, against the Facebooks, against the Googles or others, either through legal agreement or through extra legal arrangements. But it's that intermediary piece that I think is very, very important, because the genie's out of the bottle on that. And where I wonder, and where I think, the next session, to quote Lenin, since we're doing a lot of back to the past, what is to be done starts becoming really important, and where I agree with Tom. I'm not sure if things that we can do to harness in civilianized capabilities in NSA really are going to make a difference, given the fact that the capability to connect through intermediary third parties like telcos, Facebooks, and Googles exists for everyone, not just for states, but for everyone.
Well, let's see, part of the problem I had with your statement there is NSA has their own capacity to collect on the fiber nines without the companies.
Correct, yes.
That's called the upstream program. They called it Fairview, Stormbrew, Oakstar, and what was the other one? I can't remember, there's a fourth one there. But those are basically worldwide fiber optic taps, okay, around the world, and plus that included over 50,000 implants in different servers and switches, and the fact that 80% of the entire fiber lines run through the United States. Mm-hmm. That gives us the home team advantage, so to speak. That's the way they call it, mm-hmm. which means we can put taps on all these lines and get 80% of the network mm-hmm. with or without the cooperation of any telecom. Mm-hmm. Okay, and that's also just spread that around the world, and we'll get the rest of it. I estimated that they were doing at least 80% was being collected with those fiber optic taps, either with Y connectors or bend the wire, split it, and get the leaking optical photons, coming through. So the point was they can get, and my estimate was 80% without cooperation of any telco or any service provider. And since their budget is more than tripled since 9/11, that gives them a lot of money to buy NARIS devices for the fiber lines and other kinds of recording devices and tapping devices on the public switch telephone network. All that's that should easily, they should have purchased any number of that. The only problem was where they're going to put it, and that's where you run into getting the telcos, because they need the space and access points, and they need, of course, the telcos would service the rooms like in the San Francisco building of AT&T, things like that. So, but they can get that without the cooperation of telcos or anybody else, even in fiber taps on the lines under the ocean. So it doesn't matter what you do, they can get to it. It's a matter of how much they can get as to whether or not they can defeat things like Tor or other kinds of programs that try to defeat collectively putting back together the sessions that are involved. So.
Tom, did you want to come in on this?
Yep.
No, it's just the capacity of NSA goes far beyond relationships with companies. They have quite a hacking operation all by itself that has grown by leaps and bounds over the last number of years. And remember, even for NSA, because of this hoarding complex, this need to know it all, even relationships with corporations can be constraining. The recent revelation about the upstream access to Yahoo and Google servers is proof of that alone, and it's far more than that. Plus all the embedded backdoors that have been built in cooperation or embedded by themselves without the knowledge of even the corporations that produce them. It's quite significant. I mean, when I say this is unprecedented, it is truly unprecedented. And they're mapping the world. They're mapping the world electronically. I mean, practically every device can be identified individually unless you're taking extraordinary means to protect it. And none of this was necessary. I think it's really important here in answering the question, but I'm going to come around. The very best of American engineering innovation had actually solved this problem. It was the challenge problem at NSA. How do you, in a space of unprecedented data, make sense of the data? It was solved. And you can do so by providing superior intelligence and protect the sovereign rights of citizens. That problem was solved. NSA chose to deliberately reject it. Even before 9/11, if you go back, the history here is really, really disturbing. They actually were circulating a memo during the Bush's presidential transition team in late fall of 2000, seeking relief on the probable cause threshold under the Fourth Amendment. All they wanted was reasonable suspicion. We've seen what's happened since.
Let me just add one more
go
thing.
ahead,
This notion of, plus the Bull Run program about weakening encryption systems, well, they also have ways and means of weakening firewalls and operating systems and things like that. So I refer to this in NSA speak as narrow, finite shallow thinking. Because once you weaken those systems, you weaken them for everybody. I mean, as if we were the only ones that would know what the weakness was, as if others could not find them either. I mean, this is naive and stupid.
Yeah, my experience in electronic warfare is when you open up those types of doors, others will find them. Mm-hmm. It becomes its own access point. You can claim it's a covert channel and you've got special arrangements and we're so good that no one's going to find it. That's incredibly naive and also arrogant. To think that only you can get away with this, or only you can hide out in the network because your people are so good.
Go ahead, Rafal.
Yeah, I just want to sort of maybe swing the conversation back around to the fact we're talking about global implications rather than what's to be done, because I know that the next panel is going to be looking at institutional reform. So why don't we take it as a starting point here, two things. One is the genie's out of the bottle. Mm-hmm. Whether we like it or not, you know, that the sort of the know-how, the tradecraft, the method, the path for being able to duplicate some what NSA is doing is out there. And by that, I'd agree with a lot of the sort of architecture of impending totalitarianism as well. So that's something that we have to look at and simply recognize that that's going to be a reality. And if that's going to be a reality, how do we respond to that? Not just through regulatory reform where we actually have democratic rights and an ability to influence policy in a positive way, but ways in which it's going to come back to us in states where that simply doesn't exist. And here I'd interject maybe a note of optimism, because for everything that the Stasi did, for every state that's tried to dominate information, shut things down, communication, surveil, I think the pattern of the last 10, 15 years has been also for the emergence of surveillance, of individuals who empower themselves with the fact that they have access to knowledge to use that knowledge to their own effect. Look what happened in Ukraine in the last 3 weeks before Crimea. Look what's happening currently in Thailand. Look what's happened across the Middle East. I think the fact that Snowden represents, to a sense, you know, the new man of transparency who was empowered to make revelations and create change. So I'm not quite as pessimistic. I think that there is a readjustment institutionally that's going to cost lives, that's going to ruin careers, that's going to make it difficult and uncomfortable for some period of time. But I see that kind of watermark bubble, particularly in democratic societies, as having the capability to reset itself, that our institutions will catch up, you know, with the capabilities and the kinds of things that cyberspace has brought into being. Where I worry more is that the global implications may be creating things that essentially make it more difficult to find a global norm around it. That the age of enlightenment that we've had, the positive aspects of what cyberspace brought into being, will actually be shut down far more where there isn't this sort of democratic process, the democratic recourse to reset it.
If I can just ask a question I think builds on the themes you just brought up, Rafal. One, when it comes to some of these prominent sort of movements that have used social media or internet-based technologies as part of kind of disrupting existing governments, and this is to you as well, Tom and Bill, do you think that the interception collection of global data poses a threat to the integrity and capability of those kinds of civil society movements, particularly when certain countries like the United States, United Kingdom, have pre-existing relationships, political relationships with the states in question? And then second, Rafal, you mentioned in your initial address, you know, this idea of the possibility of electronic borders possibly popping up in response to this, and that there's this erosion of trust. It reminds me of the remarks of the Brazilian President Dilma Rousseff at the UN General Assembly after these disclosures first broke, you know, really calling for major initiatives to, let's say, have data on Brazilian territory and so forth, trying to avoid some of this surveillance. So this idea of the internet being kind of a global place where they can have a free flow of information, where individuals on the ground can sort of respond to and agitate for various concerns they have. How do you feel that this ties into those two questions and issues?
Well, I'll take on the first one just very quickly. I think one thing that's important to recognize, notwithstanding the huge experience that's represented by the gentleman here to my left, intelligence is still like looking at the world through a straw. It's very, very easy to translate what seems to be a capability into something that's actually usable. You know, as John Adams said, you know, we're data rich but intelligence poor. Being able to make sense of what we're looking at is very difficult. Moreover, intelligence agencies are ultimately bureaucracies, where individuals are measured by performance, which is usually fairly clearly defined. Intelligence agencies are great at targeting. They're really good at getting on target and then basically staying. They're not really built for mass surveillance in the way that the Stasi was, at least not yet, and not to a certain extent, and they find it difficult. When we look at places like the Arab Spring, but maybe more importantly looking at places like Iran, you also realize that usually security forces have a hell of a lot more bigger problems than simply looking at activists using the internet to connect the dots about why things are happening. There are fewer of them than there is the population at large, and as a result, they husband their resources where they can have the greatest effect. So I think those are just two facts that we always have to bear in mind.
There's some technical problems with that, though. The problem is, like, when you do a Google search for a phrase or a word, and the way Google returns it, you know, that you get sometimes millions of returns. Now, that's the problem that they have when they ingest trillions or tens of billions of transactions every day. If their analysts are sitting down looking for a given target and they do a query into their base, they get hundreds of thousands or millions of returns, and they can't make it through it. So the next day comes, they get another set of hundreds of thousands or millions of returns on the same query, and they can't make it through that. So every day, day after day, they can't get through this material, and that's why they're missing these things. That's why they failed to pick up all these terrorist attacks, the real ones anyway.
Correct.
Not the ones they solicit for the FBI, you know, not the entrapment stuff. They get those guys, okay? But the real ones who come in and do things, they don't get, okay? And the reason they don't is because of the bulk collection. That data is smothering them. They're not really doing it for intelligence against the targets, the terrorism or dope smuggling. They're doing it for law enforcement. That's the main customer for that data. It's for individuals, every individual in your country. That's why they're doing it. That data is there for law enforcement. So, but in the process, they complicate the analysis going after the foreign threats. Because of that bulk information. If you make the haystack orders of magnitude bigger, it's orders of magnitude harder to find your needle. It's really that simple.
Yeah, let's not be naive. I'm going to use really strong language here. I'd have to disagree in part here. What you're seeing is the intelligence agencies clearly support national interest, not public interest. I mean, this is extraordinary information. Information is power. It's the coin of the realm. They want to control it. When you have this extraordinary platform called internet and all the other electronic networks that you can gain access to through bureaucracy, through regulation, through secret interpretations of law, through special backdoor arrangements, or just simply hacking in because you've got the power, that gives you enormous leverage in a number of different fronts. And it's extraordinarily seductive to be able to, if you're the president of the United States and you're being given you know, the golden nuggets of secrets about Angela Merkel, for example. I mean, the thing that I find particularly humorous and totally hypocritical is he made a comment before it came out that we were spying on her handy and had been for some time, that if I need to understand what Angela Merkel is thinking, I just call her up. Well, no, he didn't have to call her up. He was listening to her already. So we can't be naive here. It gives extraordinary power to those who control this space. And General Hayden himself had made statements in public well over 10 years ago simply saying we need to own the network. I don't think people appreciated precisely what that meant. This has fully metastasized. And we can argue all day in terms of history. I could argue that the national security state was established in the years after World War II, but it really, really took off after 9/11. And this idea that you need to hoard it all, you need to collect and make the haystack bigger, that literally turns, having grown up on a farm, that turns every straw into a potential needle. So you can understand the thinking here that anything you collect is of value for quote-unquote intelligence purposes. But what's the real purpose for this? I'm going to repurpose it for other uses. And this is where you go down this extraordinary slippery slope. When I can be able, basically on a click of a mouse, okay, just tapping on my trackpad, or just putting a query into a database, I can instantly create a profile on just about anybody. And remember, the information is continued to collect. I mean, this gets into sort of the pre-crime, you know, and Minority Report, where I can now, in essence, I'm going to prevent crimes, or I'm going to interdict. Right? And yet we know in terms of the real threats, and there are real threats. I'm the first to tell you there's real threats. These get buried in all this. They cite 54, NSA said 54, that was their justification. 54 terrorist incidents and events were stopped, were identified, or prevented because of the surveillance, the mass surveillance programs. It turns out that we're willing to admit that maybe one, and even that one was problematic, having to do with wire transferring 8,500 to El-Shabaab.
In Africa.
Yeah. So I'm just saying, let's not be naive here in terms of what does this secret information that is now being collected on such an extraordinarily vast scale, what else is it going to be used for?
Yeah, and I don't think there's any argument with that. I certainly wouldn't argue with it. But I think, we need to also look at it from another perspective. Where would you be on September 12th, right, 2001, if you weren't able to say, yes, I've got a way of being able to track down what the next threat that I'm not expecting is going to be. And I'm not saying that to be, to throw out a sort of a straw man here, but I think it's really important because there's a zero tolerance politically for making the mistake. And I think when you look at things which are probably on the probability scale less, but in terms of their consequences more, this drives a lot of the thinking.
It's ironic you say that. It's ironic you say that because this entire apparatus, this whole intelligence apparatus in the United States, the Five Eyes, all of that was ostensibly set up so we never had the surprise of an electronic Pearl Harbor ever again. And yet, 9/11 was a systemic failure.
Right.
And instead of the leaders looking in the mirror and saying, we failed, we did not protect the public, under the US Constitution, we did not provide for the common defense, but hey, we failed, guess what? Our response to that is we have to violate the sovereign rights of citizens on an extraordinary scale and do so in secret.
Yeah,
just in case, as an insurance policy, to track down any possible lead.
Yeah, and I think that's right. And I think there's two parts of it, though, which I think are important to recognize. One, which is the internal institutional one, which we call collection creep, right? There are more now clients for secret intelligence because it was seen as being the sauce that somehow would address these unknown unknowns that everybody had. You had a mushrooming of fusion cells, crossing over authorities, Title 10, Title 50, Title 14, because that was seen as somehow breaking out through the institutional inefficiency of being able to connect the dots that previously weren't able to be connected, and somehow signals intelligence was going to give us that answer that all of us were looking for because it was the thing that no one else had access to except the NSA. I agree with you. I think there's a fallacy to that. On the other hand, I think there's also a clear parallel if we take ourselves out of the world of secret intelligence and understand that big data in of itself, the ability to be able to aggregate data at scale, does give us the ability to see the whats without answering the whys in the way that was simply unprecedented. And again, I'd go back to things like public health. The way that big data has transformed our understanding of public health. That has an analogy to a certain extent in the realm of threats to society which are not caused by disease but by individuals. And I think that's something that we need to be able to figure it out, because not figuring it out on one hand, I think, risks the kind of totalitarian architecture that I completely appreciate that you put forward. But figuring it out in the wrong way, I think, also opens us up to vulnerabilities which are also quite catastrophic. Let us not forget, and this is the low probability but high impact.
It's the other side of the
nuclear
blade.
technology is 1930s physics, in 1940s manifestation in an age of frictionless global communication. That's a challenge that politicians inevitably have to face, and which I think creates a resistance to simply saying this architecture has to be taken.
Why don't we just open up to the
that.
Q&A now, and hopefully we can get some of these responses in the questions that we have. So please come up to the microphone. Thank you.
Hello, my name is Ian. Last night, Ann Kavokian, the Ontario Privacy Commissioner, in the presentation had a slide that said that Canada had in fact worked on behalf of the American intelligence community in 20 other countries around the world, because the United States couldn't get access to these countries as easily as Canada. So my question is, based on your understanding, how complicit is Canada in these intelligence operations?
Well, the Five Eyes group is probably we consider U.S. as first party, then English speaking as second party. That's the closest relationship that we have in the intelligence community. So I would say it's very close.
Okay. She even suggested that CIC had been more egregious in Canada than the NSA has been in the States.
I don't know.
Comment on that?
That's hard to believe. That's really hard to believe. They had a warrantless wiretap on me, so and also Tom. So
You need a CSEC whistleblower.
yeah.
Good afternoon. Just a couple of quick comments and a quick question.
There's a lot more. I mean, I think you can't be naive in your own country. I mean, all
Yeah.
the statements aside, John Adams is going to defend the institution in which he led. He is. I understand that. And he's going to be polite about it, and he's going to be a gentleman about it. But the fact remains, we're conducting all kinds of operations behind the scenes you simply don't know about that are being authorized in secret without your knowledge. It's that simple.
And if we just keep questions to about 2 minutes, do you want to?
I just wanted one addition, which I think is an important corrective. I think John Adams is probably quite correct when he says, and John Forrester and what they said in front of the Senate committee, that CSEC has not broken any laws and that it operates under the oversight mechanisms that are being constituted under the law in order to provide that guarantee. The problem is, I think our expectations of the law have changed. And the institution won't move until we actually make the changes in the law itself. And I think that's where I would disagree with Tom, although agreeing with him in spirit,
No.
that legal reform is important because that's what will move these incredibly compliant institutions to change.
No, I can only add one thing here. Basically, what NSA has been doing internally in the United States has been unconstitutional from the beginning. And it took them over 8 years to get the NDAA passed to try to make what they were doing that was illegal, legal. And that includes also giving retroactive immunity to telecoms who were violating the law because they had so many crimes on their that the penalty was like 5 years in jail and $10,000 or something like that for each crime. And they were doing millions of them every day, hundreds of millions. So that was a process. We were like Pavlov's dogs, being slowly conditioned to accept the illegal, unconstitutional activity of our government. That's literally what our side did.
But the secrecy was for our own good.
Yeah.
You didn't have to know about it.
Yeah, with respect to the last comment, why do we have hundreds of thousands of people die in 2 world wars to give it up freely?
Exactly the point that we, in the last century, sacrificed millions of lives to maintain our freedoms and privacy and everything that we call democracy. Why, for the sake of a few thousand or a few tens of thousands of terrorists, are we throwing away everything that we fought so hard to keep? I mean, after all, we have done to ourselves what they could never have done to us.
I was sentenced in July of 2011. I was sentenced. I had pled out to a minor misdemeanor for exceeding authorized use of a government computer. 1 year probation, 240 hours of community service. Now, the judge did not know this at the time, but I ended up interviewing almost 40 veterans from World War II to the present day. And the World War II veterans in particular, without fail, in their own words, in some cases very poignant and very emotional, what did I sacrifice? And why did I leave all my buddies behind on any number of beaches and mountains and across the world during World War II to see the United States turn into this? Actually questioning the future of our own country, fearing for the future of the Republic. Was the sacrifice worth it? When you have veterans from World War II actually asking that question, you know we've come a long ways in the wrong direction.
Yeah, well, Occupy, sorry, just carry on.
But-
Occupy here in Toronto at the Armistice Day, there were veterans there who were 1991 who were saying exactly the same thing as that. Sorry, just quickly. I was in the Supreme Court a couple of years ago, and the judge said, the police lie. That was a statement by a Supreme Court of Ontario judge. Anyway, just the question I've got, one thing, there's 68 people here. We've only got Prime Minister because one guy called Preston managed to start a party. There's 68 of us here. We can get together in groups and start this. But my question is, are we looking at what the root cause of terrorism really is? And until we start looking at that, we're never going to get anywhere because we're creating industries. And I'm asking you, how can we shift our focus to look at why terror isn't existing?
All right, thank you. Rafal, you want to start?
Yeah, I just want to say something because I think it's very important. I completely agree with what Tom said, that I think we've done more to ourselves as a result of the bogeyman of terrorism than anybody else could have done to us. However, terrorism is not the only reason why we have institutions like CIC. That has become a very defining component simply because of the last 10 years' history. But there's a much, much, much broader mission set here as well. I think the fact that we've seen the principal threat to nation states shift from other nation states to super-empowered individuals, non-state actors, narco gangs, whatever, means that for authorities across the board, and by that I mean not the military authorities, but the whole of government, having situational awareness of what threats these represent realistically and being able to find appropriate intervention or response mechanisms is really important. That's what I said about intelligence becoming more important currently in the information age than any time before across a much wider constituency. But that's actually an argument for civilianization of some of the capabilities that have been concentrated in this secret institution, normalizing them, making them less scary, putting them under public accountability because they're not meant to be extra legal, but they're meant to be part of a legal process that's defined. That's the challenge.
Bill or Tom, do you want to come in on that?
There's just a different set of standards with a secret government versus the government we are supposed to read in our own civics books. And there's a very cautionary note here that somehow, particularly since 9/11, these institutions are exempt from the oversight and accountability that we normally afford the other parts of government and other institutions. Mm-hmm. And it just cannot stand. This is secret power. I mean, we have to be honest with what it means. And if it gets out of control, then it does threaten the rest of government as well. And they're going to come up with more threats. This is part of the perverse disincentive. There's a perverse disincentive to actually deal with the real threats and actually go into the history and understand the context for why all this occurs, because it now persists. This is a huge business. I keep coming up, and I've said this in other audiences. There is extraordinary economic incentives to persist the surveillance state, the national security state, because people are making enormous profits from it. One of the comments that was made, I'll just say it right now. When 9/11 occurred, the workforce NSA knew we had failed the nation. We did not keep people out of harm's way. People took it really hard. Most of the leadership didn't. In fact, the person I reported to, the number 3 person, said that 9/11 was a gift to NSA, and we're going to get all the money we want and then some. And Congress obliged NSA. And so huge amounts, $4 billion was roughly the budget of NSA pre-9/11. It's now, at least on what's been disclosed, program for the record, $11 billion. And that doesn't count supplementals, secret slush funds, military, and a whole lot of other. It doesn't. So you tell me who's benefiting from this. You've got to get back who's benefiting from the hundreds and hundreds of billions of dollars that are being poured into the national security apparatus, no matter what you call it, no matter how you label it.
Thanks for coming today and talking to us. And my name is Kevin Ladouceur. I'm a master's student at York University, and I was just wondering, in response to a comment Mr. Binney made, about that citizens shouldn't worry about companies because they can't do much to you. You should worry more about the police state. And I was just wondering if, could you 3 panelists talk about the issues of multinationals collecting information and their use and sharing of that information? And how do you think we can regulate these companies that transcend borders? Because the internet is a global network. And do you think it should be national governments that regulate, or should there be some kind of global oversight organization of some sort? If you have any comments on this issue. And this is for the 3 of you.
Yeah. Well, I certainly, we're getting into the next panel's discussion, I think. But
I think a brief
yeah,
taste is fine.
I think we have to have some kind of international agreement here, and we need some way to effectively verify what all our intelligence agencies are telling us. Every country's got to do this. So it's got to be a universal kind of application where, and this means getting into their knickers, as I always say it. That means having, I suggested take the hackers around the world, hire them, give them clearances, send them in there and, look into everything they're doing, right? And so they can't hide anything. It's like, when Senator Udall asked, I think it was General Alexander, how many U.S. citizens do you have in your databases, right? And he said, I can't tell you, you know. He came back with a written thing that said, we can't tell you that because it would be a violation of the privacy rights of U.S. citizens. Well, this is a documented answer, okay? Well, you know, this is ridiculous. I mean, we have to have somebody who can get in their face and shove it down their throat. We can't, passing a law, you know, having another committee or another layer of management or something, that's going to do absolutely nothing. You have to have somebody who's going to get into their business and see exactly what they're doing. And we had a proposal we sent to the president to get to them. That's on the next panel too. So, but yeah, and I think it has to be, we have to have international agreements on everybody does this with every agency, similar agency around the world. I mean, otherwise you're going to have that still go on, you know.
Yeah, there's a saying, you know, I say, who's your daddy now? I mean, the government's increasingly protecting corporate interests. And because these corporate interests are transnational in scope, they're increasingly not beholden to national borders. And they have extraordinarily vast access. And then you get into cases where even a US-based corporation is providing services to a foreign country. There's one I'm aware of in Europe. I was approached by a reporter. Well, what do we do about this? They're not supposed to be using, you know, this particular country in Europe's data, okay, for other purposes. I said, well, how are you going to know they're not? You know, they have a direct relationship with the national security establishment back in the United States. You don't think they're going to be using that as a cutout? Well, of course they are. So just because the nation state says there are rules, when I'm a company exercising influence and power inside that national state, and I'm a transnational corporation, what's going to win out? Especially if I'm serving the interests of another country. I mean, this is a real issue. I'd be really curious your perspective on this, because you're talking about transnational actors. It's not just terrorism being a transnational actor or a non-state actor. You're talking about actual entities who have enormous reach and enormous influence and enormous power. And they want to control their information as well. And they want to have access. Just think of Stratfor. I mean, Barrett Brown right now, criminalizing First Amendment activities. Why? Because Project PM was looking at what the special secret agreements were, in which you had corporations who were being pipelined actual secret intelligence. For what? And they wanted to shut that whole thing down, to send the message. So remember, it's very dangerous. It's just really dangerous. That's why you need whistleblowers, but you also need to provide ample protection for those whistleblowers. If we're a case studies and what happens, right? You're only learning about this. Remember, we're here in Canada this time because of the Edward Snowden disclosures. But you can't understand Edward Snowden without understanding what we went through. And you can't understand what we went through without understanding the background NSA, the culture, the dynamics, those interlocking relationships that existed like with the AT&Ts of the world well before 9/11.
Rafal, did you want to?
Well, I'll just add very briefly, like I said in my opening comments, I mean, I think there's certain processes that have simply been accelerated by the Snowden revelations and this sort of thing. And one of them certainly is the sort of national territorialization of cyberspace by nation states. I mean, in Russian, they always declared it, or they always talked about cyberspace as национальное информационное пространство, national cyberspace, essentially. Okay, so they saw borders as being something which was desirable because then national security law would apply. That also means that territorialization of transnational actors that exist there. I mean, we've had conversations with Microsoft, who increasingly has been fearful of the day when the Chinese government will come to it and say, you're a Chinese company, why aren't you helping us with our national security concerns? So I think that's something that unfortunately is happening. And, you know, I'm very sympathetic with what Tom says. I think, you know, there's a danger of the national security state becoming an enterprise in all states, not just in the US. And I think it's ever more likely to happen. You know, just a funny comment on what you mentioned about secrecy. In the former Soviet Union, particularly people working in sort of advanced mathematics in the cryptographic area would want to have their theses declared as secret. Do you know why? Because it shielded them from accountability and peer review.
Precisely.
And that's a kind of a systemic
part of it. Precisely. Oh, yeah.
All right, our last question,
That's
please.
great. That's great stuff.
I'll keep it short. Craig Bamford again. Bill brought up the Tor project, the onion router. My question is, the NSA seems to believe that that actually works in order to kind of keep them out, that as much as they'd like to get in, if Tor is set up properly, they can't. So considering there are two former NSA people here, is that true? Like, is the Tor project an actual tool to keep out NSA surveillance?
Not 100%,
Yeah,
but it's pretty
it's-
good. But remember, part of it's not just Tor itself, it's how you're accessing Tor. There's various means by which, even they are recognizing they have to create packages in which they incorporate all the hidden services and everything else to support it. So you're already enabled, as it were. You don't have to run through other kabuki dance things to make sure you are, because you're always vulnerable at the point you enter, but also the exit nodes are another serious concern. But because it's worldwide, it makes it much more challenging for even a surveillance state of NSA's reach to figure out down to a persona level who you are.
Yeah.
But even Tor is not necessarily always sufficient.
Yeah. So
It doesn't guarantee
Go ahead.
anonymity, nor is encryption 100%.
Rafal?
Yeah, two things. So first of all, everything at scale, depending on what scale you look at things, you'll always be able to detect anomalies. I mean, that's one of the principles of big data. Certainly, Tor in Canada is visible at the telco level because you can see enough traces of it. However, this is the important part. You may not be able to break Tor at the encryption level to find out who the individual is or the content is of communication. But that's not necessarily what you want for selector-based targeting anyway, because you'll apply other measures to be able to break the target.
The other thing is if they can't break the encryption, they'll go around it.
Yep.
That means comes through your operating system into your computer and drain it.
They'll own your
So
device.
take it after you decrypt it.
Thank you.
Makes it easier.
All right, well, can we give a round of applause to our Global Implications panel? Thank you for a very wide-ranging and informative discussion, Rafal, Stephen, and Bill. And as you know, Tom, Bill and Tom will be with us again for our reform panel this afternoon, which is also going to have Barbara Bucknell, who's the acting director of policy and research at the Federal Office of the Privacy Commissioner, and Kent Roach, who's a noted law professor and author on a lot of issues surrounding the law and charter law in particular, around national security and surveillance as well. So we just have a quick token of our appreciation for your presence. Thank you.
Thank you. Thanks.
Thank you. Thanks.
That feels heavy.
And we'll just be reconvening at about 10 past.